The world is filled with bad news. But I think for those of us who believe that, in fact, this eccentric rabbi from 2,000 years ago, who preached this completely radical new program that no one could make sense of at the time, and that made him an enemy of all the authorities of his age, and that ultimately led to his execution. We believe that he was put to death, and that he rose again, and that he was, in fact, the Son of God. Then we have such good news. How can we possibly dwell on the bad?
So in your book, you provide several definitions of evangelicalism. You trace historical definitions, you talk about the Bebington quadrilateral, but ultimately you state that there is no consensus around what evangelicalism is. How do you define what evangelicalism is? And has your conception changed over time as you've researched and written this book?
I think it's probably helpful to separate evangelicalism as an institution, as a movement, from what an individual self-identified evangelical would feel called to be and called to represent to the world around them. I think certainly evangelicalism writ large is a sort of religious movement as much as it is a social and cultural phenomenon. And, largely built around, not exclusively, but largely built around a conservative cultural and theological identity, largely built around a white identity, largely built around a Republican partisan identity, at least in the modern era. And I think obviously that is part of the problem, because when evangelical becomes synonymous to the outside world with conservative, white, Republican Trump supporter, well, then you have an awful lot of people out there who don't want to be evangelized. They're not real interested in what you're selling, even if what you're selling is Jesus, or even if that's what you say that you're selling. So this poses a lot of problems for the evangelical movement, for the evangelical church, and I would say for the individual evangelical, even those who are able to more rigidly order their own life, their own sense of identity around Jesus, around the commands in Scripture that to them supersede any other social or cultural or political imperative of the day. Even for that evangelical who wants to do right by the terminology, and for whom the terminology is precious and really means something to them at a deep spiritual level, I think they struggle to do the thing that they are called to do, which again is to evangelize. It is to share that good news of the gospel of Jesus Christ with an outside world that has come to view evangelical as a dirty word.
Right. In your book, you trace how evangelicalism, particularly since the 1970s, has been increasingly politicized. And you note what you see as three things that made the church vulnerable to its politicization, or at least as I read it. One is its decentralization, which, while at one point was noted as a strength of evangelicalism, in that people could have a variety of ways of interpreting theology, you write that it also made it, quote, ambiguous and ripe for exploitation. You also note that the lack of catechesis or theological education in the church also meant that it was easier for outside influences or even influences inside the church to reinterpret what the theology might mean and place that onto certain conservative or religious viewpoints that shifted the church And that led to this third point, the creep of norms around how politics and the pulpit meet. How did this ultimately shape the communities that you were investigating, and how might they respond to these vulnerabilities moving forward?
I think what you're observing here is in many ways the tail beginning to wag the dog. It is a movement that was at one point organized around notions of spiritual transformation and a call to carry out the Great Commission, which is to share the gospel with all the nations and to make disciples and to build the church. But along the way, I think the threats, real and perceived, that many of these folks began to see to the church, to their own subculture, to their status, I think it began to sort of slowly at first, and maybe subconsciously, but then more and more consciously, what it did was it invited a changing definition of what it meant to be a Christian, what it meant to be an evangelical Christian. You started to see a broadening of the definition, while at the same time a narrowing of the sort of the chosen people for whom the church was really their home. The church, I think, in many ways, which is meant to be inclusive in its outreach, even though the gospel itself is exclusive in its claims. Jesus saying that I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one can come to the Father but through me. And yet, the gospel was never exclusionary. The good news was meant to go to everyone, to all nations and tribes and peoples and tongues. And there was no ambiguity in the early church when Paul wrote that there is no slave or free, no Jew or Gentile, no man or woman, but that we are all one in Christ Jesus. In that spirit, the early church was radically successful in engaging a world around it that was threatening and that was strange and that truly did represent almost an existential threat to these Christians. All of that to say that when you sort of examine 2,000 years later, the way in which Christians began, and Christian institutions began responding to these threats by not doubling down on these distinctive ideals of Jesus Christ, but rather by conforming to the world around them, and by, in many ways, sort of turning to the sword of Caesar, sort of layering in all of these extra biblical definitions and identities that became almost interchangeable with their religious identities. At that point, it became less about taking the gospel to the ends of the earth and building the kingdom of God, and it became much more reactionary, became much more protective, and really, I think many of the interests and the incentives surrounding these Christian institutions in America became unrecognizable, to the point where they were fighting to preserve something that they believed was theirs, rather than sort of embracing this homelessness, this exile that the early church had sort of passed down to us, and that Christ himself had assured us of. And I think that sort of that very American, that dare I say, that singularly American phenomenon is why Christians all the world over look at us with their head sort of cocked to the side, trying to understand how we could interpret the gospel so dramatically differently than they do.
Yeah, I think the tone of defensiveness that you note, this idea that somehow evangelicalism had something that was rightfully its, that it needed to protect, was also something that I think these vulnerabilities, these shifting norms that you note about the church, they led to increasingly heated rhetoric, as the idea that the stakes of what is being defended, which, ultimately to me reads as a white Christian norm, a patriarchal one, so on and so forth, a conservative one, certainly. And as it becomes increasingly mapped onto those values, it shifts further and further rightward and becomes, in what to me seems like you're reading, co-opted ultimately to a political cause, a pursuit of power. And you note, for instance, the need to ally with what Jerry Falwell Sr. called co-belligerents, people who shared ultimate ends, even if by different moral standards, ideologies, reasons for asserting power. How has this new, as you call it, moral political framework reshaped the evangelical movement? And to what degree has it become ingrained in the ways that evangelicals come to expect what their relationship to politics is?
Well, I think if we're operating from a baseline here where we recognize that the dangers posed to Christianity, what's worth, I think, emphasizing is how, for as silly and as overstated and hyperbolic as much of this rhetoric was 50 or 60 years ago, you can look at the country now, you can look at the culture now, and actually empathize to some degree with evangelicals who look around and say, this isn't our country anymore. Everything has changed. This is no longer a nation that carries with it this sort of distinct identity of a nation sort of inspired by and fundamentally in service of or in the pursuit of a Judeo-Christian ethic, right? Look at the ways our social mores have changed. Look at the way that our laws have changed. Look at how public opinion has changed. And you can sort of understand that this panic that was manufactured in a really cynical way generations ago is now actually it's more defensible. The panic itself is not defensible, but the observation that so many of these people have that their values are under attack and that the country has turned its back on Christian ideals. You can sort of see in this 21st century context, this context of the here and now, you can understand why they would reach those conclusions. And yet, you return to the question of how then shall we live? What is the appropriate Christian response? And I think all too often, what we have seen from the church and from the institutions of American Christianity is a willingness to jettison Christian virtue in the pursuit of preserving Christian virtue. In other words, when you ally yourself with the likes of a Donald Trump because you believe that desperate times call for desperate measures and the ends justify the means and the barbarians are at the gates, so we need a barbarian to protect us, you are effectively ceding whatever moral high ground you thought that you had, but you're also delegitimizing the claims of Christianity itself in some way. You are contributing to the erosion of the church's credibility at a time when the church is desperate to regain its credibility. And so often, what I've seen and what I've struggled with is this idea that because we are under siege, because we are under attack, we are sort of justified in striking back and using the same tactics and the same strategies and fighting fire with fire. If the secular world wants to come at us, then we're going to give them just as good as they gave it to us. But in what world does that resemble the teachings of a man who stood on this mountain 2,000 years ago and said, if you're forced to walk 1 mile, walk with them another mile. If they strike you on one cheek, turn and show them the other. You've had it told to you to love your friends and hate your enemies, but I tell you to love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. These explanations, these justifications that have become so ingrained into the evangelical subconscious in the United States of America, they just are irreconcilable with the teachings of this rabbi whom they claim to follow.
This brings me to the quote of a theologian who you thread throughout one of your core chapters, which is, and he talks about what might it mean for Christians to lose well if we are, or if Christian communities in general are under siege, rather than attempting to reclaim a perceived lost status. What might it mean to accept a changing culture and reinsert yourself into a changed American landscape? How do you see that possibility? Like, what does it mean to lose well within this kind of changed landscape?
You know, what we see throughout history is that Christianity really tends to thrive when it exists on the margins, when it is removed from social, cultural, political power, when it finds its strength in the raw, radical, self-sacrificial vulnerability of its message, rather than finding its strength in its numbers, in its status, in its influence, in its authority or proximity to authority. So it's interesting that you almost tend, if you look throughout the centuries, to see this kind of inverse relationship between the health and the organic growth of the Jesus movement, if you want to conceive of it that way, all throughout the world. An inverse relationship between that and how much power, cultural, social, political power, that Jesus movement has. Because that power corrupts. And it tends to corrupt in ways that rob the church of this distinctiveness. And you know, Jesus says, you know, if the salt loses its saltiness, what is it good for? Throw it on the ground, trample it under your feet. What good is it to have salt that isn't salty, right? So if he calls us the salt of the earth, I mean, I think when you sort of get into the Greek etymology here and nerd out a little bit on some of the biblical language, it seems very clear to me, having studied this, that what he's saying is that you are unique. You are set apart for a purpose. But when you begin to conform yourself to the patterns of the world around you, even if you believe that doing so is part of a sort of grander scheme, a three-dimensional chess game where it's actually helping you to promote the gospel or to share the witness for Jesus in the long term, but you're sort of having to, no, you have corrupted yourself. You have compromised yourself. And in so doing, you have, I think, kneecapped your own ability to witness for the gospel in a way that is believable. You might stop taking religious advice from your neighbor who claims to be a Christian when he is hammering a Trump lawn sign into his front yard and singing the praises of this man whose own words and actions and lifestyle betrays every core teaching of Christianity. And so there's an essential credibility gap here that Christians have to reckon with to ultimately find your citizenship in heaven. Then your pursuit of a different kingdom here and of all the trappings of that kingdom here, which is a centuries-old temptation, it eventually leads to ruin.
Yeah. You often, throughout the book, discuss the ways that the change in political affiliation in the church and the intensification of the rhetoric has led to this decay in reputation. You note some jarring statistics: the decline of the number of people who call themselves evangelical writ large, the decline of the number of people who identify as Christian, even within that, the number of people who regularly attend church, all of which have had staggering declines over the past 30, 40 years, let alone, as this movement continues to go, where they might continue to fall. This book, in many ways, is a study in schism, what it means for a formerly unified group to slowly find difference and differences in political affiliation, differences in what is right, what is just, what is defensible. And yet you still use the term the church as if it's a singular entity. If this is a deeply divided community, given these fractures, can we actually call the church a single thing anymore?
Part of what I've attempted to do here, however imperfectly, is to ask that everyone might step back and reassess where their idols are and where their identity is ultimately found. And that's, I think, a very challenging thing to do in this moment in American life when a lot of folks feel, for different reasons, that there is an imminent threat and that they need to sort of take up with their tribe in order to protect themselves from that threat. And maybe once this moment passes, we'll all look back at this and be a little bit ashamed of the role that we played or didn't play in the church getting to this point. But I, for one, choose to retain some shred of optimism that all of this will work together for good for those who love Him. Then I have to accept the ugliness and the discomfort of these moments. And they are ugly, and they are really uncomfortable. But it diminishes my faith in man. It does not diminish my faith in God.
I think by way of closing, you've noted several things that evangelicals might do or focus on or re-emphasize as they attempt to continue to carry out what you see as the mission of evangelism within the church. What is it that you see in order to reclaim or reorient or head in that direction again, what should evangelicals be fighting for?
The world is filled with bad news. And it's understandable why, for some people, they just become fixated on that bad news. And then that fixation turns to responsive action. They have to do something to counter the threat. They have to find some meaning in encountering that bad news with solutions, with prescriptions. But I think for those of us who believe that, in fact, this eccentric rabbi from 2,000 years ago, who preached this completely radical new program that no one could make sense of at the time, and that made him an enemy of all the authorities of his age, and that ultimately led to his execution. We believe that he was put to death, and that he rose again, and that he was, in fact, the Son of God. Then we have such good news, and it is of such great joy, and that it is so overwhelming. How can we possibly dwell on the bad? How can we allow our actions, our words, our identities to be driven by or rooted in all of the bad news, all of the threats, all of the challenges, all of the anger, all of the brokenness? It seems to me that if in fact we believe that the only cure for a hurting and desperate world is Jesus, then we should get back to Jesus. My dad was a pastor, and I lost him 5 years ago this summer. And one of the things that he used to say from the pulpit all the time that really stuck with me was he would say that, if we're Christians, then we are in sales, not in management. Meaning that your job is not to worry about the collapse of the world around you. Your job is not to try to prop up something that is broken. Your job is not to be filled with angst and anxiety about everything that's going wrong and be trying to sort of put it back in its proper place. You'll never be able to. Your job is not to manage the world around you, the culture around you, the people around you. Your job is to sell the good news of Jesus. And if you can do that with your words and much more importantly with your actions, then I think there's a certain peace that surpasses understanding that will in fact settle over your heart as a believer. A peace that you will never find in the culture wars or in the political conflicts of the day. The only real solution to this is what we thought it was. But I think we have to begin reorienting our entire approach and looking at the world through the lens of Jesus rather than looking at Jesus through the lens of the world.
A powerful note to end on. Thank you for joining us in this dialogue and for sharing your work with us today and later in your lecture. It's been a pleasure to have you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. I really enjoyed it.
Appreciate it.